Good evening, everybody. We've got a special program for you tonight in that, vultures are a critical species to a healthy habitat, and they're under serious threat worldwide. So often overlooked or, not paid too much attention to, but a serious issue. So we're happy to have a program on that. And thank you to our presenter, Kim Thorburn, past president of Spokane Audubon, a frequent field trip leader, Christmas bird count leader, frequent program presenter, and a tireless protector of sagebrush steppe habitat at Swanson Lakes and elsewhere. Also, for the last 8 years, commissioner on the Washington Fish and Wildlife Commission, now retiring. And she happens to be a great birder, great person, great friend. And so I'd just like to say thank you very much to Kim for presenting to us tonight. And with that, the program is yours.
Thanks, Gary. Let me share my screen. So, well, to start off, a little recollection of one of my favorite birding experiences about a decade ago in Costa Rica during spring migration. We had several days of raptors flowing over us, heading north in huge numbers. These are the long distance raptor migrators, many of them coming from as far as Patagonia and heading up to northern or North America. Many of them were turkey vultures. In fact, the vast majority were turkey vultures. What happens is they come from all points in South America, and then at the isthmus, they all narrow together. So they're just pouring over in these huge numbers. We had some storms, so they would fall in for a perching for a day in the storm. And it was just really an incredible sight to see. I recollected my childhood in the Central Valley of California, where the raptors would spread out, but one of the migration sites is the Central Valley, and we'd have large numbers flying over in both directions during the migration period of turkey vultures. This roost, some of you may recognize, is at the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge at the Pete French Ranch. You probably recognize the National Wildlife Refuge symbol of the observation tower. So with those remembrances, tonight I plan to present some information on taxonomy and a few other pieces of both New World and Old World vultures, and then turn to some interesting facts about the biology of these birds. General, a lot of them specific to New World vultures, which I'll get to in a minute. And then talk about how the biology of it folds into conservation and what's being done to try to preserve these really important species. So we'll start with New World vultures. They are actually their own family and order, the Cartharidae family. They're distinct from other species of birds. There are currently 7 species in 5 genera. And I've been fortunate enough to see all 7 species. It's a real high point of birding for me. And 3 of the species in the Cathartes genus are closely related and look a lot alike, actually. The turkey vulture is our most wide-ranging New World vulture, with breeding as far north as southern Canada. And the migratory species will go as far as Patagonia in South America, although there are more stationary subspecies in the eastern part of the United States. Their cousins, the lesser yellow-headed vulture and the greater yellow-headed vulture, are South American birds. The greater yellow-headed vulture has actually a rather small range that is limited to the Amazon basin. And then there are the very large vultures, the California condor, the Andean condor, and the king vulture that are somewhat related. The 2 king vulture and Andean vulture are South American birds, whereas the California condor, of course, is limited now to small range in the southwest of the United States. So the thing to note, I put symbols of the International Union of Conservation of Nature status. They're the ones that develop the red list of species, all kinds of species, not just animals, but plants as well. And so the good news about New World vultures is most of ours are species of least concern. That's what the LC is. However, not surprisingly, the California is the highest level of endangerment, critically endangered, although it is making some recovery. It's still not recognized that it will sustain without continuing efforts at recovery, and we'll talk more about that later. The Andean condor is considered vulnerable. That's what the VU is. So it's the other species that isn't fully healthy. The population isn't considered fully healthy of the New World vultures. It is doing well in some parts of its range and is actually extirpated probably in some of the northern part of its range. So there are many more extant species of Old World vultures. I say extant. There are also many, many, many of the Old World vultures that are known to be extinct. And that somewhat relates to the fact that these are very old taxa and came up during the Pleistocene. There have been such changes, of course, in the environment through many, many epochs that some of the extinction just results from the changes in the environment that no longer support the species. These birds are members of the Excidipree family and order. And so they're related to hawks and eagles. there are two clades. A clade means that the birds all arose from a similar ancestor. Sort of like all the subvariants we're getting of the Omicron virus, of the SARS-CoV-2. That's what a clade is. They all came up from the same ancestor. So the smaller clade is here on this slide. And as you can see, and you'll see on the next slide, old world vultures tend to be in more trouble and higher listed on the red list than our new world vultures. The NT means near threatened. So that's kind of the next step up from least concern, which the palmnet vulture is. And then the Egyptian vulture is endangered, and that's one step down from critically endangered. So we'll see more of these symbols on the next slide. These are kind of interesting birds. Unlike New World vultures, many Old World vultures are not fully obligate scavengers. All New World vultures, that's what they live on, carrion and rotting substances. Many of the Old World vultures do have other types of forage that they take. For instance, the palmnet vulture takes its name from the fact that it eats mostly palm nuts. And in fact, one of the reasons it's a species of least concern is as palm nut agriculture has grown across Africa, its range has actually expanded into the palm nut plantations. It has a pigmented face, and it takes the pigment like many birds with orange and red colors in their feathers or their skin. It takes its pigment from the palm nuts that it consumes. The bearded vulture is also really interesting in terms of its forage, and that it's the only mammal or bird that lives solely on bones. And the preference is bones, of course, that are high in marrow, so smaller bone species, but it actually has the capability of digesting most of the bone. As you know, most avian species that consume bones actually expel them as pellets, but in the case of the bearded vulture, bones are what they eat. So pretty interesting species. Turning to the much larger clade, here we see that many of these species are in trouble, near threatened, critically endangered. The white-rumped, the white-backed is critically endangered. The Cape is vulnerable. I point those out. They're all closely related, and also the white-backed vulture is the only one that I've ever had the opportunity to add to my life list. I saw it flying over Bucharest in southern Namibia, and the reason I point that out is it is another species that's in trouble in the northern part of its range, but less so in Namibia. That's pretty interesting because Namibia is well known for outstanding conservation efforts that include game farming and hunting, and it's quite frequent to find species that are in trouble elsewhere in Africa that are doing quite well in Namibia. So it just made sense that I was able to see a white-backed vulture flying high, several of them actually flying high over Bucharest. And in Namibia. There have been instances of hybridization, at least one instance of hybridization between the Cape vulture and the white-backed vulture, so they are pretty closely related, as noted. But again, many of these critically endangered and endangered, just not doing well. The Old World vultures and New World vultures are examples of what is called convergent evolution. In other words, they don't come from, as we noted, the same families, so their ancestors are really not connected. And what convergent evolution means is that phenotypically, they're quite similar, but they're not genotypically very closely related. So there are environmental factors that contribute to the phenotypic similarity. And in this case, they are, well, not, the Old World vultures are not obligate scavengers. It is probably the most important part of their foraging. And so the fact that the avian scavengers have certain characteristics that are very similar, even in different families, completely different families, probably results from some of the behavior that and biologic features that are needed for scavenging. For example, avian scavengers hunt by soaring, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. And then they also, as you note from the photographs, all have bare faces. The New World vultures are unable to grab with their feet the way that hawks and eagles can. They're actually made for walking around on the ground because that's usually where their forage is. And their beaks are tend to be quite long, and while they vary among species in terms of being able to penetrate the carrion, they are important for being able to access the carrion. It's interesting that these features of scavenging and soaring are all related to and probably causative in terms of the conservation concerns that arise for these birds. So a few things about biology, things that you've probably noticed about vultures. One is it's not uncommon to see them perched with their wings extended. There are actually two kinds of extension that the vultures have. The one that I think we all think of is the wings out, is shown in the photograph. But they also will extend their wings, holding them out, but back over their tails. There are a number of reasons that they do the wing extension. It's quite common as they leave roosts at night and come out before they start soaring. Often they have moisture on their feathers as a result of night roosting, and so it's done for drying of the feathers. It's also important for temperature control. Both heating and cooling is a feature of the extended wings. And then the featherless face. There are probably several important reasons for the featherless face. One is carrion can be pretty messy, and it's a little bit harder to clean your face feathers than other parts. So it probably has to do with grooming and cleanliness. But also the face is important in temperature control as well. And again, both heating and cooling. Maybe you've noticed as you look at turkey vultures soaring that it's really common to see primaries missing. And they actually molt their flight feathers, that is the secondaries, the primaries in the feathers, as well as the tail remiges. They molt continuously. So they always will have some feathers missing, but not a lot of feathers missing. And that we can speculate that's probably necessary for birds that make their living by soaring, to have flight feathers consistently, unlike, say, waterfowl that actually lose the whole thing at once and become flightless. So their molt is, at least their flight feather molt, is probably explained also by their need to be soaring as a means of hunting. So their foraging is interesting. They're as Gary noted in the introduction, they're sort of nature's cleaner and really, really important to ecosystems. If you think about rotting or carrion, there are two things that happen. There are sort of macro scavengers that come in and can clean up fairly quickly, but there's also micro scavenging that goes on, and that's bacteria and viruses. And the bacteria in particular make the carrion fairly toxic. The bacteria do their work by excreting toxic substances, and so if it was totally left to micro scavenging, the environments would become fairly stinky and fairly toxic as well. So macro scavenging is important. And it also contributes to the biology of avian scavengers. There are not a lot of animals that can eat really rotten stuff. So they have at least really highly acidic intestinal systems that helps with digestion of these toxic substances. But another thing that's important is trying to get to the carrion before it starts rotting a whole lot. So that's the feature of soaring. They get there soon before there's a lot of micro scavenging going on to start work. And it's actually the turkey vultures in the New World that take the lead on that. They find carrion both by sight and by smell. And they actually have the best olfactory capacity of finding carrion. So turkey vultures are usually first in areas where they overlap with the black vulture. Black vultures often are moving with turkey vultures, but often higher, and they'll watch the turkey vultures go in and follow them in. And that's also true with the two yellow-headed species, as well as the larger ones as well. That gets to the next point that I'm going to make about agonist and interspecific behavior. these are basically gentle birds. You don't see a lot of fighting and arguing on carcasses or in roosts or that sort of thing, but there is definitely a pecking order. If it's a single species or agonist behavior, the pecking order tends to be larger birds and older birds. So you've probably noticed when you come on carcasses that there may be multiple birds around, multiple species, but usually only one or two working the carcass at a time. So with turkey vultures, they're smaller than black vultures. So if they may find the carcass, when the black vulture comes in, the black vulture will usually be the first at the carcass, and the turkey vultures will just stand back and wait for the black vulture to finish up. And in situations where you've got even larger vultures like the condors or the king vulture, they'll also step aside for those first in the interspecific foraging. I'll point out, if I can get my, if I can see my, this on the right-hand side where it says the king vulture and the turkey vulture, the king vulture is sitting in the very middle trunk there, and the black vulture is on the right-hand side. You can see the size difference. The king vulture is not quite as large as the condors. And unlike the other New World vulture species, it tends to be more solitary. When I've seen king vultures, they've generally, again, been flying quite high, although this was actually down. They must have had we didn't see the carcass, but they all must have been on a carcass. But anyway, they're flying quite high, and often they're the only one in with maybe a group of turkey and black vultures or yellow-headed vultures and black vultures, which is distinct from other vulture species that tend to be quite communal. They do communally roost. It's thought that mostly they're loose family groups. The young are fed by adults months into their juvenile years. So it's thought that family groups kind of stay together and communally roost, although you will see interspecific roosting as well. So that gets us to the conservation issues. The fact that that these avian scavengers can manage biologic rotting, it makes them susceptible to other kinds of toxins. And so a lot of the reason that these birds are so threatened is that the food that they're eating is poisoned. The New World vultures have had a lot of poison threats, specifically in the Indian subcontinent and Asia, because of the use of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs in farm animals. It's been a real challenge to get rid of diclofenac in India, although it has been outlawed because cows are important to Indians, particularly the Hindus, and the pharmaceutical industry and veterinarians and agriculture promoted giving these drugs to older animals to keep them comfortable. And as a result, a number of the New World vultures of the Indian subcontinent crashed, the populations crashed very, very, very precipitously about the 1990s to the early 2000s. When it was discovered what was going on, India outlawed this, but they've outlawed diclofenac and that practice, but they haven't really been able to enforce it, which I think is an important message about conservation. So much of the threats to species come from social practices. And what's really needed is to understand the socio-cultural practices that lead to the threats, and then to try to work with populations to provide alternatives and prevent the threats. And there are actually many conservation groups in India and in Africa that are dedicated to vulture conservation and are working to approach the threats in that way. And in fact, I'm not sure how I can do this. I was going to read, I can't get rid of the picture. I was going to read this poster that I found in Glacier National Park about the Andean condor in Argentina. Basically, it says that it says that it's a symbol of the Andes, and it has an extraordinary capacity of flight. Its wingspan is greater than 3 meters. And it's actually, and it points out in this poster, it's the only New World vulture that is sexually dimorphic. The male has a comb that the female doesn't have. This poster is actually bragging. Glacier National Park is a refuge for the Andean condor. And it points out that the Andean condor, is, you'll recall, was listed as near threatened, but it's doing quite well in Argentina, as opposed to Venezuela and Colombia, where it's been extirpated, the northern part of its range. And that was because it was believed to be a predator of lambs, and so it was hunted and shot and has not really been able to recover. Argentina is another country that has model wildlife conservation practices and has obtained a lot of land that they call national parks for conservation of species that are in trouble. The California condor, of course, survives because of captive breeding, and it's a fascinating story. It was one of the early successes of captive breeding. I want to point out that the wing tag is used in lieu of leg bands on vultures. The reason is one of their cooling mechanisms is called urohydrosis. They actually urinate and defecate on their legs, and it helps with cooling, just like us sweating. But when they put leg bands on vultures, they determined that they could cause sores and infections because of this practice. So when vultures are marked in recovery programs and that sort of thing, they use those wing tags, and that's true not just in North America, but throughout the world in vulture recovery programs. They put wing tags on them. Captive breeding is used with New World or Old World vulture recovery as well. But the story of the California condor was really quite fascinating. There were only a few left in the wild by the 1970s. It had diminished its range considerably. The California condor used to extend as far north as Washington. Lewis and Clark talked about the California condor. I'm not sure they called it the California condor at that time, but when it was finally fully brought in, its range was a small area in Southern California. It was the captive breeding program was really controversial and actually opposed by National Audubon and the big Audubon chapters in California. They did not want to see the birds all brought in. It actually started, they were going to try to leave a few pairs in the wild just to, the idea, I think, of the biologists was to have people continue to have the experience of birds in the wild. It wasn't felt necessary to recovery. But eventually all birds were captured and brought in. It's been highly successful when what they do, these are slow breeding birds, all vultures, whether they're Old World or New World, and 1 to 2 eggs, and often not once a year. So what they do is, with a successful breeding pair in captivity, is actually remove the eggs and just keep them breeding, and then they incubate the eggs. But as we know, it has been a successful program in terms of providing birds that have been released, and we now have birds back in the wild. At the time that the condor recovery program was begun in the late 70s and early 80s, there was some belief that the reason for its demise was inadequate forage. They were around during the time of the mammoths, and so there was a thought that they needed really, really big carcasses to be able to survive. And so the idea when they started releasing them, and actually before they brought all of the condors in, was they'd take big cattle carcasses out to places where they knew that birds were feeding and provide them with feed. And that they were hoping that would be sufficient for recovery. As we know now, probably the greater threat to the birds and the reason that they became so rare is lead poisoning, and that continues to be a threat to their full recovery. California has, in the a condor country, has prohibited lead ammunition. That hasn't been highly successful. And again, there are efforts. There's a group that's called the Non-Toxic Ammunition Partnership that runs out of the Peregrine Fund, that now runs all of the California condor recovery, that works with hunters through outreach. We actually are doing a lot of work with them in Washington, and trying to encourage non-toxic ammunition as the only kind of ammunition that's used in hunting, and also working with manufacturing to make non-toxic, non-lead ammunition available. This is going to be important to ensure that California condors someday are free flying. We're going to have to be able to accomplish that. So just again, the vultures are, as a result of their biology, probably contributes to their threats and demise. They're a real example of the challenges of recovery conservation. They're obligates in many cases, at least in the New World, which means in contrast to species that are more generalist, can range widely or particularly have opportunity for different kinds of feeding. And so in instances like that, if the cause of a demise was a threat like eagles, for example, where it was DDT, if we can just get rid of the threat, then recovery is guaranteed. But in the case of vultures, there are so many cultural factors and other kinds of socially economic issues that need to be considered, especially when they're obligate. Recovery can be difficult. For example, the teaching of shepherds in Bolivia that no, these are not the animals that killed your lambs. They're here on the carcass, but they're not the ones that are threatening your stock. So a lot of energy and effort needs to go into recovery when you have things beyond just a simple threat like DDT. So with that, that's what I have to say. This is a bird that roosts on my California house. He's a young turkey vulture. You can tell because his face is darker than the older birds. So if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Yeah, Kim, I've got a couple of questions. Let's see, the leg cooling idea, now do all of the vulture species tend to use that technique?
Yeah, it's pretty universal, yes. Temperature control is really important for these birds because they, during the day, actually may go through large temperature variations. Soaring way up there, they can be quite cold. Oh, and I didn't mention another threat. The vultures are the main avian cause of airline collisions. Not surprisingly, they get up there that high, so that's a huge human conflict issue with vultures.
Well, and a quick follow-up question would be, do many of the other bird species use the leg cooling approach, or do we not?
I don't know the answer to that. I just know that it's so important for vultures because of this temperature variation they go through, but no, I don't know. There was a question I just saw about the wing tags. I know that's a concern with tagging with all sorts of things like hanging collars around necks and putting backpacks on birds. But the tags are really very light material. So yeah, it doesn't seem to bother their flight.
I got a question. Tina Penny here. I'm part of the Save a Bird team for the Audubon Society. One thing that I had learned from one of the rehabbers I worked with when capturing vultures is it true that they will, as a part of a defense mechanism, regurgitate on you? So just want to
Yeah.
be prepared. If we have to capture one, it's going to puke on us.
Yes, they will.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's what I thought.
I've had that experience, not capturing them, but being in the midst of a group of them. Yes. So,
There was another question about what do the turkey vultures here eat besides carrion?
they're pretty limited to carrion. They will occasionally eat insects and maybe small mammals, but they don't really have the capacity, and claws to capture things. So it has to be done pretty much with their bill. So they're almost exclusively carrion. They like small to medium size. They'll certainly, if they come on a deer carcass, but the problem for them with deer carcasses, as I talked about, is they'll often be pushed off. We have non-obligate carrion eaters, of course, like eagles that will push off the turkey vultures. So they look for smaller carrion to not be so threatened, not threatened, but pushed off.
Let's see. I had a question regarding the condor recovery, the California condor recovery. The idea of taking the eggs of successfully laying females obviously sounds intriguing. Any ideas about how many eggs a female might actually lay if you keep taking the egg away?
No, I don't know the answer to that. But it seems that they'll keep laying, sort of like chickens.
Another question from the chat. Do other birds such as eagles and magpies that eat carcasses have the same tolerance to the bacterial toxins?
Not as much. So they will not stay on the carcass as long, and they're not as efficient at cleaning carcasses. In fact, when and they can contribute to actually spread of disease, they think, and maybe not the avian predators as much, but when there was the crash of the vultures in India after the diclofenac fiasco, the scavenging was replaced by feral dogs and non-vulture avian predators. And there's speculation that it actually contributed to a sort of nationwide rabies outbreak in India, because rabies is very, very common in feral dogs, and there was a huge explosion of the feral dog population because of the availability of the carcasses. But again, they don't clean them as well, so it creates a problem.
Kim, I don't know if you mentioned this, but my understanding has been that vultures have a better sense of smell than most birds. Do you know whether that's true?
Many do, but not all. The black vulture doesn't use olfactory foraging or hunting at all, but the turkey vulture has an excellent sense of smell, and other of the old world vultures hunt by smell as well. So it's not universal, but it is well developed in many of them.
Thank you.
There was a comment that Donna was stalked by turkey vultures after doing the dead man float. They circled me for a day waiting for me to die. I think we all believe that about vultures, but I'm not sure that they actually wait for animals to die. I think it's more common actually for them to be hunting carrion. It needs to have a little bit of rotting for them to find it. So, but I think we all sort of have that feeling as we look at a kettle of turkey vultures flying overhead on a hard hike or something like that.
Kim, what's the time frame that we see turkey vultures here?
So they aren't here a lot. So they arrive maybe late March, but more often early April, and they're gone by October. And you can actually see them. They go a little bit further, so it's fun to watch them as they're migrating. They're coming in kettles and flying overhead. It's pretty neat to see them.
I ask it because I do a winter raptor survey, and we actually saw a huge group of turkey vultures a couple of years ago in November, late November. And I thought that was odd. But
yeah, that's late. It is odd. Yeah.
And Kim, growing up in California, I always thought of turkey vultures as just being around all the time. And then, coming up here, I realized, okay, well, they're migratory here. Is that a subspecies difference? Obviously.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, there are different subspecies. So in California, some of those, there are similar vultures that will actually do the long distance migration, but there are also more resident vultures as well. And there are a number of subspecies of turkey vultures. They're different sizes. Actually, the resident turkey vultures of South America are smaller than our migratory birds that come from North America. So they'll be pushed off of carcasses. The residents will be pushed off of carcasses of the turkey vultures that come from North America during the winter down there. So yeah, and the resident turkey vultures of California, I think, tend to be more coast range and coastal. And they forage on, you'll see them around the beaches, as you know. They lots of good forage for turkey vultures, whether it's dead birds or as I showed in one of the slides, or dead sea mammals, fish, that sort of thing. Those tend to be the resident turkey vultures in California.
Another question, turkey vultures hold their wings in a V, dihedral in flight. Is that common in all other vulture species?
It is in the New World vultures. I'm not sure about old world vultures, but yeah, the New World vultures tend to have a dihedral profile in flight.
And another question, someone had taken a picture of a vulture and noticed the nostril area was a hole that they could actually see through. Is this common in birds?
No, it's a vulture feature, and it's not true of all of the vultures. It's a New World vulture carcidity feature. So,
Yeah, I don't see any further questions. All of them very good and interesting.
I'll say.
I don't see any more.
I have a comment. I used to work at the Peregrine Fund's World Center for Birds of Prey in Boise, Idaho. And they have both Andean condors and California condors, which they breed in captivity. And so if you ever have an opportunity to be in Boise, I'd suggest visiting.
Yeah, they actually are running the recovery now of the California condor.
Right.
So yeah,
Yeah,
important entity.
yeah.
So I did see a question about flight during how far they'll fly. They are long distance flyers even during the day. They have to cover a large area often to feed.
Okay, well, it looks like we've kind of slowed down here.
I
Anyway,
did have one question.
oh, good.
Kim, what's the average clutch size of our turkey vultures and such? How many do they raise in a year?
Yeah, one to two. It's small. They're very slow reproducers. All vultures
That's
are
what-
very slow
all of them.
reproducers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I knew that was true of the condors, but I wasn't sure about the regular vultures.
Well, thanks everyone.
Yes, thank you so much, Kim. Great.
Thanks, Kim.
Okay, and yeah, thank you to everybody else. Have a great evening.